The small house looks quaint, and the front steps are flanked by two swan statues at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Passing by, you wouldn't give it a second look. Inside this house, however, unimaginable things are happening. What started small in 1971 escalated to such a degree by 1974 that local police, firefighters, friends, and family didn't know how to help the Goodin family. And how could they? Who would ever think that they'd walk into a scene where the kitchen table flips over on its own, knives fly across the room, televisions tip over, and unexplainable banging sounds keep you awake at night? This isn't a script from a horror movie. It's what the Goodins, law enforcement, and firefighters all experienced inside this house over the course of several terrifying days. So what exactly was it? A poltergeist? A demonic presence? Or was it a hoax, all coordinated by a 10-year-old girl? In this episode, we're covering part 2 of the Lindley Street haunting. If you haven't listened to part 1, I highly suggest it. You can find it just below this episode on your favorite podcast platform. Get ready to question everything you thought was possible. Welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth, and this is the true story of the Lindley Street haunting. If you enjoy well-thought-out episodes of true crime and the paranormal, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button. Your support helps us bring you more true crime and paranormal episodes that will always keep you on the edge of your seats. In the previous episode, I'm not going to give too much away. There's far too much to cover in a very short section. But we did learn about the history of the owners of the home, the Goodins, about their son that was born and the daughter that they subsequently ended up adopting. And then shortly after she came into the home, all of the different things that began to happen. We left off in part 1 with all of the activity occurring and the police and firemen coming to the home. One of the firemen suggested that they call their chaplain, which they did, and this would be Father Doyle. And Father Doyle did agree to come over. And that's where we pick up. Now, upon learning of what was happening, Father Doyle did agree to come over to the house. As soon as he entered, he could feel a presence. He said the house felt thick and heavy, and he wasted no time in saying that he felt an evil in the house. Father Doyle had also brought with him a rosary, holy water, and a Bible. He made the decision right then and there to bless the house. He couldn't do an exorcism on his own, but he could bless the house. Hopefully, this would provide some kind of relief. He took out each of his items and set them on the table next to him. As he began the blessing, he reached for his bottle of holy water, and as he did, it tipped over so that he could not reach it. Immediately, Father Doyle put away the Bible, the rosary, and grabbed the bottle of holy water. Everyone was confused. Was he not going to bless the house? Father Doyle said he didn't want to make anything worse than it already was. And instead, he just said a quick prayer and promised to get in touch with someone who was more able to deal with the situations at the Goodins, an exorcist. A friend and neighbor of the Goodins had come over to the house to see if she could help. She had noticed the police and the fire presence outside the house and became pretty concerned. She learned all about everything that was happening inside the home and immediately knew who she should get in contact with: the Warrens. Ed and Lorraine Warren were considered experts in the paranormal, and she had just been to a lecture of theirs recently. So she went back home and called them immediately, telling them what was happening inside her friend's house. After listening to her, the Warrens agreed to visit. They then called up Father Charbonneau, who often worked on cases with the Warrens, And they ended up bringing along a 21-year-old seminary student as well, Paul Eno. Now, Paul, he had just been scheduled to just have dinner with the Warrens, but instead, he ended up coming with them to a house whose events would be seared in his mind forever. The officers were still inside the Goodin home, and they were at a loss as to what to do. So what they did is they called their superintendent, Joseph Walsh, and told him about the events that they had just seen. They had said they believed it was a poltergeist. Instead of receiving support, he laughed and told them to hurry up and finish whatever it was they were doing and get out of there. Now, somehow, word got out about the house, and sure enough, later that Sunday afternoon, remember, this is all happening in the early morning hours and early afternoon of Sunday, reporters from all around the area began to arrive outside the Goodin home. All of a sudden, in this group, there was this murmur in the crowd. More than one person swears that they saw the two swans, which flanked the front steps of the Goodin house, turn towards one another and say something. They couldn't make out what was said, but whatever it was a disturbing sound. As the day wore on, the crowd began to get more bold, and they would walk up to the windows of the house and look inside to see if they could see anything strange happening. One of these folks happened to see Marsia holding a book with a strange symbol on the cover. This soon became a rumor that Marsia was into the occult, and that is why things were happening in the home. The book, it turns out, was a prayer book brought into the house by the 21-year-old seminary student Paul Eno, and Marsia just happened to be holding it. On Monday, November 25th, the crowd outside the Goodin home had grown exponentially. The Warrens, along with Father Charbonneau and Paul Eno, had come to the home. The activity had not stopped. Now, Paul, the young seminary student, he was put in charge of keeping an eye on Marsia. Now, not only did they want Marsia to keep safe, but what they had learned was that all of the activities seemed to center around her for some reason. While Paul was keeping an eye on her, that pungent, rotten egg smell of sulfur again started up, and it was coming directly from Marsia's room. Now, the night before, Ed Warren and Father Charbonneau, they had had a discussion, and they strongly felt that an exorcism of the home was needed. And they mentioned this to the Goodins. Now, ironically, even though the Goodins were avid churchgoers, they didn't believe in ghosts or poltergeists, but they really couldn't think of anything else to explain what was happening inside their home. So they agreed. After the Warrens got the okay from the Goodins about the exorcism, Ed and Lorraine headed back home to get everything arranged. Paul Eno stayed behind with the family. In the meantime, something was happening with Jerry. He couldn't explain it, but just knew, felt, whenever something was about to happen in the house. He started to get one of those feelings and mentioned that something was about to happen. All of a sudden, a smoky mist started to form in the living room. It was transparent and somewhat solid all at the same time. Inside this mist, Jerry, Laura, and Paul could make out 4 distinct figures that looked like human bodies. It also smelled like acid. Without warning, Jerry began to recite Mass in Latin. He didn't even know Latin. Marsia, Laura, and Paul just stood there in shock. The voice didn't even sound like his. As these figures moved across the living room, Paul Eno moved to block one of the things from moving past him. He would later say that he felt something when he did that, some substance, a bony-like substance. Now, very little is known as to what happened after this incident. There's no record of the mist dissipating or when Jerry came back to himself or anything of the sort. All that we know is that later that evening, Ed and Lorraine came back along with Father Charbonneau. They had been sitting around the table at the Goodins discussing the exorcism. when Lorraine's hand began to form a blister on the top of it. It was red and it was incredibly big. Ed became very concerned about his wife and what was happening, but Lorraine promised that if it got too bad, she would be sure to remove herself from the situation. They had dealt with far worse. The Goodins requested that Father Charbonneau bless the house. On Tuesday, November 26th, additional officers arrived at the Goodin home. Now, one of them was a serious disbeliever. He found it hard to swallow that these things were actually of the supernatural, and he thought for sure it was all of Marsia's doing. Forget that things had happened while Marsia wasn't even in the home, or that were things that occurred like the refrigerator lifting that a young girl couldn't even do. But one day, while this officer was there, Marsia took her foot and pushed at a television, making it move. This was his aha moment, and from then on, believed that all of this activity was Marsia's fault. I don't know if this officer just wanted something that was real, that he could point to and rationalize in his own mind as to what was going on or what. But from that moment on, Marsia was the only one to blame. Now, Marsia, she knew that the officer had seen her do this, and so the officer sat her down and had a talk with her. She admitted to the officer that, yes, it was her that had created all of the activity. Now, personally, I believe that Marsia was scared as hell of this new guy. She hadn't seen him before, and he was already of the belief that was her. We don't know what he said to her to get her to admit to things that she could never, ever have done, but nonetheless, she did. Now, it's important to consider this, though. Maybe Marsia was telling the truth, that it was all her. How is that possible, you might think? How could a 10-year-old lift a refrigerator or create the knocking sounds around the house, throw televisions over, flip the kitchen table, make knives fly out of the knife block, and even cause dark figures to walk through the living room? There was no way one girl created all of this, especially when it happened when she was away, right? But what if Marsia was the carrier of this spirit, this poltergeist? Her friend said she would show up and run to Marsia's room, where she'd find Marsia speaking in a different language, and she was very young at the time. What if this thing, whatever it was attached to her? And this is the reason that she needed to be adopted so quickly. Now, I'm just throwing ideas and thoughts out there, but no one has ever said if they contacted the agency who put her up for adoption and actually asked them if strange things had happened at the agency. No one also really explained why Marsia was put up for adoption in the first place. Maybe this had been happening most of her life, and instead of getting help for her, her birth mother just decided to place her for adoption. Anyhow, let's continue with the story. Marsia is still talking with the officer who saw her move the television with her foot. Marsia then, for some reason, told the officer that the blister that Lorraine had gotten on her hand was because she had put it under very hot running water to cause it. Now, no amount of hot water coming from the home itself could have possibly caused the blister that formed on Lorraine's hand. Yet the officer fully believed everything that Marsia was telling him, probably because it fit his own personal story. When the officer told Jerry and Laura what Marsia had admitted to, they were devastated. So were most of the people who had become so deeply involved in the situation. But the problem was everyone just wanted an answer, and this was the easiest answer because Marsia had admitted it. Wednesday, November 27th, was the day that Police Superintendent Joseph Walsh had announced to the press that the whole thing was a hoax, and shortly afterwards, it hit the radio and television. This was also the first time that the Warrens, along with Father Charbonneau and Paul Eno, had heard about it as well. When the Warrens and Father Charbonneau showed up at the Goodins that Wednesday after hearing this news report about the hoax, they were turned away. The Goodins told them they didn't need their help any longer. When Paul Eno showed up later, he was told the same thing. That evening, the activity in the home continued, but the only ones allowed inside the house now were friends and family of the Goodins. After the hoax announcement on Wednesday, the crowd outside of the Goodin home began to dissipate. By Thursday, most of them had gone, except for just a few diehards. That same day, the Goodins left to visit Jerry's brother and didn't get home until after 10 o'clock that night. It was then that Jerry smelled smoke. He looked around the house and couldn't find where in the world it was coming from. He then went outside, where he had found a fire just beginning directly outside of their home. Later, 3 people would be arrested for it. Their explanation? They were trying to get rid of the evil in the home. The beginning of December of 1974 actually were quite quiet in the Goodin home. And the Goodins, I'm sure, were relieved to have some peace to themselves, knowing that they may have to deal with the same issues next November, as this seemed to be the pattern this thing, whatever it was, followed. Little did they know that they would not have to wait until the following November. On December 10th of 1974, even though the story had made the news that this whole thing was a hoax, there was still a police officer stationed outside the Goodin home. Now, whether this was because someone tried to set the home on fire or for another reason, we don't know. What we do know is that this is an officer who was never involved in any other visits to the home, and that on this day, Laura ran out of the house and up to the officer sitting in his squad car. Her eyes were wide and she was in an obvious panic. She screamed that weird things were happening again, but this time it happened all at once. At the same time, the kitchen table had flipped, the televisions fell over, and the furniture in the living room all upside down. The officer scrambled out of his car and ran inside the Goodin home to see for himself what was going on. After stepping inside, he called for backup. From December 11th through the 13th, 1974, the Goodin family once again found themselves trapped in a nightmare. It was too much for them to take on, so they left on the 10th and headed to stay with family. They then made the decision to take a small trip away from the home, but first, they had to go back to the house and pack. On December 11th, they walked inside their home to gather their things for their short trip. What they found was beyond devastation. The house looked as if it had been ransacked, and it was an utter disaster. One of the most unnerving items they found was that their Christmas tree had been pulled down, and you would think that all of the ornaments went right with the tree, right? Well, sort of. Only someone or something had taken all of the ornaments and put them in a neat pile right next to the downed tree. They didn't want to take any more time than they needed, so they hurried up and packed and left. The next day, they were back, and upon walking inside, saw all of the living room pictures now crooked. A shelf in the kitchen was now hanging upside down, and a statue of the Madonna had her thumbs removed. Again, they left to go stay with family. They then decided to call Father Doyle, again, their local pastor, and tell him what had been happening. On December 16th, a man by the name of Boyce Beatty contacted the family and told him that he was involved with a group called the Academy of Religion and Psychical Research. He was an expert in the paranormal, and he wanted to speak with the Goodins to see if he could help in any way. The Goodins agreed, but made it very clear that they wanted to keep everything private. On December 18th, Boyce Beatty, his colleague Keith Blue Harari, and Jerry Solfin, a parapsychologist who specialized in something called RSPK, or recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, arrived at the Goodin home. Now, Blue was an expert who investigated things like remote viewing, psychokinesis, and other psychic phenomena, as was Jerry Solfin. They were all convinced that in some way or another, Marsia was the one who was causing this, but not as a hoax. No, they felt that she somehow, or rather her emotions, were creating this havoc in the home, even though Marsia herself was completely unaware of it. Before arriving at the Goodins, Boyce and Blue paid a visit to the Warrens. They knew they had been involved, and they also were skeptical about this whole hoax story. They wanted to get an idea as to what it was they were up against when they visited the Goodins. In addition to visiting with the Warrens, they also paid a visit to the Bridgeport Police Department and told them what it was that they were doing. They were especially interested in the police reports that had been done on the case to date. When Boyce and Blue arrived at the police station, they actually met with the same officer who had officially said the case was a hoax. The officer then went on to say that he had been instructed by his superiors to label it a hoax, although he didn't seem as convinced about it as his superiors seemed to be. They asked to speak with the officers that had witnessed what had happened at the Goodins, but some were reluctant. They were worried that they might lose their jobs or they would be looked on as being crazy. These officers were assured that whatever they released to this group would not be shared with their superiors. On December 27th, 2 days after Christmas, the shades in the Goodin house started rolling up on their own again. Curtains again fell down. Bathroom items were again tossed around, and a picture decided to bang itself against the wall several times before stopping. Both Jerry Solfin and Blue Harari were present when the television in the living room fell over on its own. They noted that both Marsia and Jerry were downstairs at the time feeding the cat. December 28th, 1974 was Marsia's 11th birthday. Friends and family arrived to help celebrate. And while it was a time for a celebration, there was also this underlying tension and anxiety. No one knew what might happen. During this time, relatively little did happen. A picture of Jerry fell off the wall, and many people there also mentioned that the stereo seemed to be in a different location than it was before. Now, this group that had come in to help the family, consisting of Solfin, Harari, and Beatty, they believed that Marsia was the focus of this activity, and they gave it a name, PSK, psychokinesis. They believed that Marsia was able to move or manipulate objects using only her mind. But if this were true, did she always have this ability, or was this something that had developed over time? The investigators felt that because the Goodins were overprotective of Marsia, not allowing her to walk even to and from school on her own, even at 10 years old, and not allowing her to go across the street to play with other kids her age, played a big part. Additionally, the fact that Jerry and Laura were still dealing with losing their one and only child. It's been said that every time the plastic roses in the vase from Jerry Jr.'s grave moved around, that Laura would tell Marsia that it was Jerry Jr. causing all this chaos in the house. But if it were in fact Marsia, how does this explain the smells of sulfur and the ghostly figures that were seen walking in the living room as witnessed by Paul Eno? On January 10th, the Goodins listed their home for sale. They didn't feel that they could live a normal life in the area any longer with this stigma of what had happened in their home, and for all we know, was still happening. No further information was given as to if the case was actually closed or not. However, the group that was the latest to investigate concluded that the activity in the home was 100% real, and it was most definitely not a hoax. After a year of the house being on the market, it still hadn't sold, and the Goodins couldn't move anyplace else until it did. So they tried fixing it up. They removed those swans from out front. People had actually taken pieces of the statues as souvenirs. I kind of wonder if any of those actually exist anywhere right now. The Goodins then painted the house white, and still a lot of people came and looked, but no one purchased. When they realized that they wouldn't be able to sell their home, they remained in the home for the rest of their lives. They also unlisted their phone number and stopped giving interviews. If anything continued to happen in the home, the Goodins would never say and will never know. Now, even though the Goodins decided to live their lives privately, they still did send yearly cards to Boyce Beatty, updating him on their lives. But, the information was always really limited. On June 11th of 1993, Laura Goodin died in a car crash at the age of 68. On September 24th, 1997, Jerry Goodin passed away from natural causes at age 78. As for Marsia, well, the story goes that as soon as she was old enough, she left the house to seek out her birth parents, and it was said that she went to Canada. Even with private investigators, no one seemed to be able to find her. It turned out that she never did go to Canada, but instead was living in Ohio under a different but similar name. She evidently never spoke of the events that happened on Lindley Street. On February 10th, 2015, Marsia Goodin died of natural causes at the age of 51 in Ohio. Now, while it seems very young to have passed from natural causes, we'll never know the real reason for her death. It is said that before the Goodins lived in the home, and even after they left, nothing more happened. We don't know if during the entire time that they lived in the home, if the activity continued, if it stopped once Marsia left, or any of those questions that still bother us today. It is, however, one of the very few paranormal cases that actually have documentation provided by the police and fire department personnel. The actual police reports, along with a ton of other information about things that happened in the home, can be found in the book called The World's Most Haunted House: The True Story of the Bridgeport Poltergeist on Lindley Street, and it's by William J. Hall. I'll have the link in the show notes for you. And make no mistake, yes, people have often made reference to the address of the home, 966 Lindley Street. A coincidence? To date, the Lindley Street haunting remains one of the most well-documented paranormal cases in American history. And quite frankly, we're kind of left with more questions than answers. Was Marsia really the focus of these events, as some of the investigators believed? Was there something already present in the home that came to life due to the high emotions, such as losing their son and bringing a new family member in? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think was really happening in that small house in Bridgeport? Now, if you think that these kinds of things only happened years and years ago because they didn't have updated tech, you'd be dead wrong. Our next episode will prove that bone-chilling paranormal activity isn't just a thing of the past. We're going to jump forward in time and head to Gary, Indiana, where a mom trying to do the best for her kids is caught in the middle of something she cannot make any sense of. It's terrifying. It's witnessed by hospital staff and caseworkers and priests. And next week's case, I believe, is even more scary because of the secret way that it invades this family's life. And it all happened just back in 2011. So join me next Tuesday as I dive into the case that people refused to believe until they actually saw it for themselves. Can a house in this day and age truly be possessed by evil? Until next Tuesday, my friends, thank you for listening, and I will talk to you very, very soon. Bye for now.